Hello and welcome to China. Happy Year of the Pig. My name is Robert Garmong. I am a philosopher by training, an educator by trade, and I've lived and taught in China for about 10 years now. And one of my favorite things is to introduce people to aspects of Chinese culture that maybe they weren't familiar with. And today I want to give a little bit of an introduction to the Chinese Lunar New Year celebration. As I'm speaking, it's 2019 Spring Festival season, and so happy year of the pig. If you hear some extraneous noises in the background, I am at my in-laws' farm as we speak, and so that just consider it a little bit of authenticity. You may hear some parts of the family celebration as I'm speaking to you. The Chinese New Year is the most important holiday in China. It's the most famous. It's the one that people would have heard of. Many people are very interested in Chinese culture these days. And if you have seen the Chinese New Year celebrations in any major cities in America or anywhere there's a sizable Chinese population around the whole world, you'll know a little bit about Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year, is sort of the equivalent of Thanksgiving, Christmas, and our New Year's celebration, and maybe even a little bit of Easter, all kind of rolled into one. And I guess you could even argue a little bit of Halloween, because there's a lot of superstition connected with the holiday. So it's the most important holiday by far in China. All others pale in comparison. So let's go to understand a little bit more about the so-called Chinese New Year or the Spring Festival celebration. It is based on the Lunar New Year, and as you are probably aware, there are two ways that you can mark the year. One is the solar calendar and the other is the lunar calendar. Western countries traditionally have used the solar calendar going all the way back to the earliest days. But most Asian countries have always used the lunar calendar. Lunar New Year is not going to line up exactly with the solar New Year. It approximates it, but it wanders around vis-a-vis the solar New Year. It always falls between January 21st and February 20th. And I believe that's an iron law of geometry. I don't think it's possible for it to fall outside of those days, as far as I'm aware. This year it happens to be on the 5th of February. Next year, for example, it will be on January 24th, I believe is the first year of the next new year. So it wanders. It happens to be in a retrograde cycle, and then it will move forward after that. So this year, February 5th, starts the year of the pig. So as we're speaking, we're in the very first days of February, so we're well into the New Year season here in China. Right now, we're still on the tail end of the year of the dog, so we're still wagging the tail of 2018. If you're a dog, I hope you've had a good year, and we'll welcome in all our friends who are pigs. The festival season itself lasts a total of 15 days. The actual festival begins with the New Year on the 5th and ends with the Lantern Festival on the 15th day of the Lunar New Year. And as with many things in the history of China, it begins with a kind of folk tale, a tale of kind of superstition, the story of Nian. And this is, as I understand it, this is a modern invention. And incidentally, there, the history of this particular festival goes back millennia, in fact. It goes well before the BC era. And so much of what I'm going to say today, there are different interpretations and different ways that you can construe things. I'll give you my sources to the extent that I know them, but in some cases, don't necessarily take what I say as gospel. There are different versions As I understand it, the story of Nian is one that actually was a fairly recent invention. It came up in the early 20th century, but the celebration itself goes back millennia. And this story is a way of kind of explaining the traditions of Chinese New Year. Nian is the word for year, but it's also the name of this particular kind of demon type character who is described as being a lion type uh, uh, beast as big as an elephant with razor sharp teeth. And the story goes that he terrorized the villagers of a particular village in China. In some versions, he comes from the sea. He lives under the sea for most of the year, and he emerges only at Chinese New Year. In different versions, he comes down from the mountains at Chinese New Year. But in all versions that I'm aware of, he comes once a year and he terrorizes the people of this village. And they would all flee and try to hide from Nian so that he wouldn't kill them. And then one year, an old man came by and uh, offered to or asked to stay in villagers' homes, and they were all too busy escaping from the beast, and except for one elderly grandmother who offered to let him stay in her home. But she said, "You don't want to do that. You want to run away with the rest of us." And so she let him in, and he said, "No, no, I'll stay. And I promise you the beast will be subdued." And she said, "Yeah, whatever." And she ran with the rest of the villagers. Well, that night, this elderly man turns out to have known a little bit about the beast, and he was aware that the beast was afraid of loud noises, he was afraid of bright lights, and he's afraid of the color red. And so the old man lit the house with fire and candles. He decorated the door with red paper decorations and incantations for good luck. And he lit bamboo stalks on fire. If you know anything about bamboo, when you burn it, because it contains different chambers that are filled with air, it blows up like a primitive firecracker. So he had the lights, he had the red colors, and the bamboo going boom, 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 boom. Nian came to the village. He saw this house that was so brightly lit, and he was frightened, and he fled forevermore. In one version, the old man was seen riding away on Nian's back, so he had apparently subdued the beast. In other versions, the beast just fled. But now, as a kind of way to ward off the beast each year, we recapitulate the old man's behavior by decorating with red paper, keeping our lights on until midnight, and lighting nowadays fireworks. Nobody burns bamboo anymore. It's fireworks are better. So that's the version. Traditionally, of course, the Lunar New Year was always a time of extreme concern for superstitious Chinese. And by superstitious Chinese, I mean virtually all Chinese, because this was traditionally a very superstitious culture. The legend of Nian itself arose in the early 20th century, as I understand it. Sometimes you'll hear people say it's an ancient story. No, the story arose in recent years. It's about supposed ancient events, but it's apparently a very recent story about this monster that terrorized the local populace. And you can think of it as kind of a just so story to explain the traditional New Year's celebrations. Those traditions long predated the actual story of Nian, but it's a nice way to kind of summarize how we to this day celebrate the Chinese New Year. And often in the big cities, you'll see lion parades, which are a kind of tribute to Nian. And the lions are typically very brightly colored and so on. Sometimes they're fairly harmless looking. This little guy doesn't look to me like he would terrorize villagers, but I guess he's cuter than a savage beast. So today, how do we celebrate the Lunar New Year in China proper? It's typically not referred to as Spring Festival. It's referred to as Lunar New Year. It's referred to as Spring Festival in China proper. Why is that? Well, it relates to the history of modern China. During the modern era, since the end of the last dynasty in 1911 and 12, China has officially followed the Western, the solar calendar. So all government business and major companies would follow the solar calendar. But people typically still celebrated the Lunar New Year as their New Year festival. And many people, the common people, would resist this push for the new uh, modernized calendar. But the government wanted to make sure that China was entering kind of the whole world, the modern world of Western countries. So we had for many years you had the both calendars side by side in the celebration of the Chinese New Year as an important part of the year. In 1967, the Chinese government actually outlawed the New Year celebration as part of the Cultural Revolution, where they were trying to wipe out the traditional old Chinese beliefs. Under the Communist Party's leadership, they wanted to, even though China at that time was seen as a kind of hermetic country, sealed off from the rest of the world, they wanted to be seen as modern and at the vanguard of the world. So they saw this celebration as kind of a holdover of ancient China. So it was actually banned for quite some time. It was brought back during the economic reform period after 1979. It was once again allowed for people to celebrate. And in 1996, the government actually decreed a 7-day federal national holiday. It's not a federal system. They don't have federal holidays. And so since then, there's been a 7-day official holiday for the Lunar New Year, but they still feel a little bit conflicted about it. They don't want to call it the New Year, so they brought it back under the name of Spring Festival. And that's a traditional name. It was an alternative way of referring to the New Year, but it wasn't, it's now the official name for the holiday. Certainly doesn't feel very much like spring, but of course, this is when the days begin to get longer, and so it's the harbinger of spring. So you can think of it as an aspirational reference to the spring. So that's the history of the holiday. Now, how is it actually celebrated in modern China or in today's China? Well, the first thing is it's a family holiday. Families must get together, even if they have to travel long, long distances. And of course, in contemporary China, many people go away from their hometowns for work, and so they may have to travel a day or more to get home for this holiday. This, as you can imagine, causes travel nightmares. You do not want to be taking a train at the height of the Chinese New Year celebration. Just as a kind of point of comparison, this is the largest mass migration in the world by a lot. For example, U.S. Thanksgiving is the largest holiday for travel in the U.S. And I believe this was a 2017 number, there were approximately 46 million trips taken. So that includes road trips, flights, whatever. The Hajj, which is the Muslim pilgrimage, the annual pilgrimage, had in the same year 2 million trips. Well, in 2017, in China, there was an estimated 2.8 billion trips during the holiday. So 46 million for U.S. Thanksgiving, 2.8 billion. And the vast majority of those would be by train. So you really want to stay away from the train stations. If you want an example, just Google Chinese New Year train or Lunar New Year train or Spring Festival train. You'll see some jaw-dropping pictures. So travel for family get-togethers. Typically, then there would be huge feasts, just like our Thanksgiving or Christmas. We might have a big dinner. So in China, and there would be certain traditional foods, and especially in the past, there would be certain foods that you must eat on the New Year. Now it's quite not quite so strict, but still it's traditional to have a very large festival dinner. And then again, on the Lantern Festival, often people would have another big family dinner, although that's not quite the big festival that the Lunar New Year is. And another major tradition is to light off fireworks. We'll talk about this more later, but this in the past was a major part of the New Year's tradition. And last, you put up home decorations, and this would be something that you do on the actual day of the holiday. And everywhere except for China, you would have big public celebrations with lion dances and dragon dances. You can see these, for example, in Hong Kong. They have huge ones. In Taiwan, it's very big. In China, for the previously mentioned reasons, they discourage the major public celebrations for the most part. You'll still see it in maybe in Beijing, maybe in Shanghai, the big, more international type cities where China is putting a kind of public face forward. But as far as local areas, smaller cities generally will not have the big celebration. You can't really talk about Chinese New Year without talking about the effects on the economy. Many Chinese people depend heavily on their year end bonus. In one recent survey, 92% of Chinese employees, that's from the very top to the very bottom, get some sort of annual bonus. And typically, unlike in the United States, where you might get, you sort of expect a little bonus. Maybe in some industries, working for a smaller company, maybe that's a bigger part of your annual compensation. In some companies, maybe a smaller part. It's not. It's seldom a major issue in the U.S. In China, it often is. It's expected to be at least 1 month's salary, and often that's written right into your contract. So you're paid on a 13-month basis. This is their incentive to make sure that you work through the end of your contract, so you get that extra month's pay. If you leave early, you don't get it. So it's a kind of little perk for the employee and also an encouragement for the employer. But if assuming that the company has been doing well, then it may be up to as much as 4 months worth of salary. So that's a third of your annual salary for your bonus. So in many industries, this is really your primary kind of compensation. And it's paid as a sort of incentive to return after the holiday. It's also a kind of, it's a way of signaling for the employer to say, we're a thriving company, we're doing well. So you can see, in a way, looking at it from an economist perspective, it's actually kind of a beneficial situation for the employer because they're incentivized to give a generous bonus. If they don't, then people will assume that they're not doing well. From the employee's perspective, it's a little bit like I guess, your annual tax refund if you get one from the IRS in the US. It's a way of kind of incentivizing you to use that money in one chunk. So typically it would be heavily saved. Generally speaking, all or most of it would go to your parents. So you go home at the holiday flush with cash and proud of yourself for a hard year's worth of work. So basically, during the year, many Chinese workers get just enough to eke by on. So they may live in a company dormitory, either rent-free or very cheaply. They eat in the company cafeteria, again, cheaply, if not for free. And they get a tiny little monthly salary to pay whatever small expenses they have. but they expect at the end of the year they'll get a nice big bonus. And that way, and this has been well studied, if people get their money in small increments, they tend to fritter it away in small increments. So actually, it makes a lot of sense, although it gives a great deal of uncertainty. You never quite know until the end of the year what your bonus is going to look like. So this means that a huge amount of spending takes place at this time as well. Obviously, for travel expenses, many people who don't choose to go home for the holiday will take a tour, a trip. So travel agencies are extremely busy. It's also a time when you buy small gifts, especially food like fruits or cakes, sweets of all kinds. So bakeries and those kinds of things do a bang up business at this time of the year. Also, maybe gifts for your family members and so on. So it's a big economic boost each year, and this because it varies each year the exact date. It adds a little bit of uncertainty to the economic data, so you never quite know until after the New Year's holiday. So many people are doing, for example, economic number crunching on the Chinese economy will wait until March when the holiday is well and truly over before they make any summary of the year's economy. So the Spring Festival timetable is very important. We're already, as I'm speaking now, well into the New Year season. You can see here the dates as of 2019, what to expect around the streets, especially transport, and then what to expect to be open and what your work schedule might be. During the run up to the holiday, the streets will be cleaned and decorated. It's traditional to clean people's houses, so you might see a lot of people. If you happen to be in China at that time, you may see a lot of trash being thrown out as people are cleaning out the detritus of a year. It's also a time for shopping for the new year, and schools wind down after, in this particular year, January 26th. At this time, transportation becomes increasingly insane. You really do not want to be traveling at this time. It's the worst time of the year to be traveling. This is, as I mentioned, this is the largest mass migration anywhere in the world. So the train stations will be backed up, airports will be going crazy. It's really a nightmare if you have to travel. You'll start to see things winding down as far as businesses and companies. Still, most of the shops will be open at this time. Now, on February 4th, Chinese New Year's Eve, people will traditionally decorate their home. It's expected that you do that on or as close as possible to that particular day. They have the big reunion dinner, blow firecrackers, typically starting at dusk. You may start hearing some as we speak because it is getting dark outside right now. And people within the family will give small gifts. As I mentioned, usually this would be fruit, small candies and sweets of various kinds, and red envelopes filled with usually cash. Generally, that would be for children or for elderly relatives. And at this time, travel is very quiet because everybody's already gotten where they're going. Most companies will close, if not before then, certainly by noon on New Year's Eve, very much the same as in the US, for example. Big shopping malls might be open, but there might not be any shops open in them. Generally, even the big supermarkets like a Walmart and so on would be closed by noon on that day, or certainly in the early afternoon. On actual Chinese New Year's Day, traditionally you would visit friends and relatives. In old China, this was the day for visiting if you're a married couple, you would visit the husband's family on that day. And it's considered taboo for the wife to see her family on that day. That's to happen on the second day. Again, it's very quiet on the streets that day because you've already gotten where you're going. All offices would be shut. Only essential, police would still be open, of course, those sorts of things. And again, the shopping malls would be open. Not many shops would be open. Almost all the stores might would be closed. Maybe the big supermarkets will be open on that day. Then in the subsequent days, you begin visiting a wider and wider circle of your friends. Traditionally, in old China, the second day of the new year, so in this case it would be February 6th, traditionally would be the one day of the year when a married woman would be allowed to go visit her family. Because in old China, she was considered to have married into her husband's family. So she's really no longer considered to be a member of her biological family. She's now a member of that family, and it would be kind of divided loyalties if she were still going back to visit her old family. So on that one day of the year, she would be allowed to go and visit her family, and she would bring some gifts and so on. Obviously, in today's China, that's not the case any longer. But if you read old stories of the 19th century and before in China, it would be that way still. And traffic is coming back to normal during this time. The official holiday is 7 days. So after that time, then the public holiday is over. People are starting to go back to work. Most government offices would be back to work. Travel, again, gets to be very ugly at that time, although not quite as bad as in the first few days before the holiday, because a few people will have been trickling home already. If you look at the data for number of train trips, for example, it's about 10% greater during the week before the new year than it is during the week after that 7 day period, because many people will have gone home during that 7 day window. So it's not quite as horrible, still not recommended. And schools will reopen on February 27th. The Lantern Festival is the last official day of the holiday, and again, very busy during that time. We can look at the same timetable, but in a kind of graphic representation. You can see the preceding days, cleaning, shopping, and then putting up the spring decorations, family reunion dinner, red envelopes. Typically, you stay up till midnight, light off firecrackers, and for those who still hold the older traditional beliefs, they might offer sacrifices to their past ancestors. And then you can see visiting relatives and friends and so on, and then the Lantern Festival. I think everyone knows that the New Year is always associated with an animal that's part of the Chinese Zodiac. And this is a 12-year cycle. It goes rat, the year of the ox, the year of the tiger, the year of the rabbit, the year of the dragon, year of the snake, horse, goat, also sheep. It's the same word in Chinese, so sometimes you'll see it as goat, sometimes you'll see it as sheep. Then the year of the monkey, which happens to be my son's year. Year of the rooster, which is my year. Year of the dog, and then the last year, this year, is the year of the pig. Now, I'm going to cover this in more detail in another podcast, so we can kind of skip over it at this point and move on to what we do at the Lunar New Year. How do we actually celebrate it? And the first big thing is we give red envelopes, or hongbao in Chinese. This is typically would contain money for children and young adults. The tradition is they say, if a young child says Happy New Year, it's with a motive in mind. It's not purely out of the goodness of their heart. They expect you to give them a little bit of cash. Obviously more for actual family members. And not on the New Year per se, but in the lead up to the New Year, you would also give a hongbao to service people or important, not your own employees. They get the official year-end bonus, but maybe somebody whom you wouldn't normally be giving a bonus to, but kind of an annual tip. We don't tip waiters and so on in China. We don't tip taxi drivers, but we do give a little bit. And if you need advice on how much to tip somebody, you can ask a Chinese friend. They'll give you some advice. Also, money related matter is very important in China. If at all possible, you pay off all your debts before New Year's Day. You don't want to enter the new year with debt on your shoulders. And very much like in the West, we consider New Year's to be kind of symbolic of what you're going to be doing for the new year. So it's considered important to begin it without a burden of debt. Eating is a very important part of the new year, of course, and we're expected especially to eat certain lucky foods. As I mentioned in the past, there would be very strict traditions on what you must and must not eat. Now it's not as strict, but there are certain things. Fish, in particular, is a big one. It's not universally the case, but it's very commonly the case because the word yu sounds like the word for jade, which in ancient China was one of the major sources of wealth. And it's also the word for surplus. So if you eat fish, and typically on the New Year's festival, you would eat, but you don't want to eat the whole fish. You want to leave a little bit left over for the next day, again, to symbolize surplus that lasts into the future. So it's heavily symbolic. Dumplings, or jiaozi, this I say of course because practically any Chinese holiday, somewhere in the list of what you're supposed to do to celebrate will be eat dumplings. And in this particular case, again, it's to do with the celebration of the new year because it's believed that jiaozi dumplings look like a traditional gold brick in old China. So here's a picture of what the dumplings look like. And here is a traditional old Chinese brick. So if you take that Chinese gold ingot and you lay it on its side, you can see it kind of resembles a dumpling. So that's, again, sort of a symbolic thing. And particularly on the Lantern Festival, there's a kind of sticky rice cake. I personally can't stand them, but it's tradition to eat them to do with high status. There's also tradition related to your clothing. You're expected to wear red on the new year. And especially, for some reason I'm not aware of, red underwear is an important thing. Don't ask me why underwear in particular, but wearing red is considered to be important. Red in China, of course in the West, red is kind of a bad thing. It's sort of a warning color. But in China, it's the color of lifeblood, health, good fortune. So it's important on the new year. And also, again, related to the idea that you're bringing in the new year with new things, you're supposed to wear new clothes if you can. Now, how do you welcome the new year or greet someone at the new year? There are many different greetings. You can find lists of them online. The most common traditional New Year's greetings, 恭喜发财, literally means something like wishing you wealth. There's not a direct translation, but close. Then you may just say, have a good New Year's celebration, focusing on the particular day, 过年好. Or you may say, 新年快乐, happiness in the new year, something like that. 快乐 means happy. 新年 means new year, literally. So those are the things you do on the new year. Now, what not to do on the Lunar New Year. And now traditionally there were a huge list. It's a very superstitious country traditionally, and there were many things. Still some things that people that would resonate more with contemporary Chinese. You don't want to get sick on the new year. Of course, that may not be something that you have much control over, but it's if you can, avoid getting sick on the new year because the idea is that you'll then have bad health all year. You don't want to sweep the floor or take out the garbage. The idea being that your good luck will go out with it. Now that's specifically on the day of the new year. So that's one reason why you really want to clean house before the new year happens, so that you start the year with a clean house, but you don't want to do your cleaning on New Year's Day. You don't want to wash your clothes or especially to wash your hair. You'll wash away your good fortune. So again, you need to do those things beforehand. You also don't want to cut your hair on New Year's Day. Remember, 恭喜发财, wishing you wealth in the new year. The fa of 发财 is also used for hair. Exact same word, exact same Chinese character. So the idea is if you cut your hair or you wash your hair, that's washing away the money or fortune that might come in the new year. And there are many, many more that you can find online. Oh, yes, you don't want to use knives or scissors or anything dangerous, or be very, very careful because even a minor accident will make people think you're going to have bad luck all year long. So be careful on the new year so you don't hex your whole year. And as I say, you can find many, many more don'ts for the new year, but these are the ones that Chinese people today, in my experience, still kind of semi believe in. Much as I don't like superstitions myself and I sort of scoff at the whole thing, I think these are sort of cute and mostly harmless, so I don't mind following them as much as possible. I don't get too upset if I get sick on the new year, but it's cold outside, it's to be expected. So anyway, those are your do's and don'ts for the Chinese New Year. And lastly, do enjoy the season. Do enjoy the holiday season, the time for some rest, and don't worry too much about the taboos. No one really worries about them that much these days anyway. And, of course, don't let Nian get you with his razor sharp teeth. So that's the Chinese New Year. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned a little bit about contemporary Chinese culture. And again, don't necessarily take my word as gospel on these things. There are many disparate views, and every part of China has its own variance on the generalized Chinese culture. So you may find in your particular village there are more or fewer restrictions, more or fewer things you're supposed to eat, and so on. Just go with the flow, enjoy the holiday. It really is a lovely time. It's a lovely time, especially if you have the opportunity to be with some Chinese friends and their family. If you have the good fortune to be invited to their home for the New Year's dinner, then consider yourself to be very, very blessed. It really is a wonderful time. So, lastly, I'll just say, 过年好，恭喜发财.